Hey everyone, thank you for coming to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a few minutes as we wait for late arrivals, so just hang tight. We'll get started at about 12:03. Thank you. Welcome everyone to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to give it about one more minute, so just hang tight as we wait for some late arrivals. Okay, so it's 12:03, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I hope you all can hear and see me. If you're having any trouble throughout the webinar, either being able to see the slides or you're having any audio connections, please drop those into the chat box. Other than that, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please drop them into the Q&A function and we will answer those until the end. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at Tech Equity Collaborative. In my role, I can get to engage with our supporters and our members through volunteer opportunities, events such as these, and now I get to engage with you all here. So as I mentioned, feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box as we go, but we won't answer those until the end. A little bit about what we'll be covering today. We'll talk about why Tech Equity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we have identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved and how we can take action to address our region's most pressing economic issues. But before moving on with the conversation about Tech Equity, I wanted to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar during very tough times this year, and particularly tough for Black people. And as an organization, we've discussed how to best respond to the situation, including changing or canceling some of our events throughout the year. But we feel that it's still important that when thinking of issues like police violence and police brutality, that we also address larger racial structural inequities within our economic systems that are supporting and withholding a police state. So we want to continue hosting conversations such as the one today and provide space to talk about structural racial inequities. And I encourage you all to support organizations that are on the ground organizing just as much as organizations that are responding to the racial inequities within our economic system. So if you're interested as an organization, we released a statement, I think about 2 months ago, which you can find on our website. And we've included ways in which you can step up and organizations you can support if you're able to. So why are we here? Well, TechEquity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods. And they understood that there was a perception that tech and tech workers were the problem. They noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, increases in traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions. Especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. At the same time, tech workers have been relatively unscathed, so the pandemic really has the potential to even further exacerbate the inequality that our region was already facing. So this is the state of our housing crisis and affordability crisis in the Bay Area. I think the fact that rents are rising really isn't a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know and feel this. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated. So just before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And since the pandemic, about 1.6 million Californians have filed for unemployment, and it's probably way more now. I mean, this only goes up to April, but meanwhile, experts are believing that it's not likely that rents will fall much during this economic downturn that we're currently in. So rents may go down eventually, but are more likely to flatline. But people's incomes won't rebound quickly enough. So renters are actually in a worse position overall. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed out into homelessness or worse. So communities are frustrated, and considering the graph we just looked at, it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success, but also have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them. However, we see that when tech begins to shoulder the blame for our region's issues, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that further divides our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. While we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that many within the tech sector remain relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. We have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. Because of our affordability crisis, which is now compounded by the virus, we're at risk of losing so many critical components within our community that really make the Bay Area the hub of diversity and innovation, as we all know and love it to be. And over the last few decades, housing costs have skyrocketed due in part to limited supply. So the housing crisis was already incredibly challenging for many families prior to the pandemic. And now, as thousands are filing for unemployment weekly, already unaffordable rents are impossible to meet. And as a result, we've seen how longtime residents are being forced out, and we've seen how difficult it is for lower and middle income people to live near their jobs. So while some workers are finding success, many others are struggling to make ends meet. And families that were already challenged by the status quo are now finding themselves unable to weather this new crisis that 2020 brought. But we don't think that it has to be this way. At Tech Equity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. Together, we can make it out of this crisis stronger than we were before, but only if we invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. We have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're going to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At Tech Equity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement within those communities. So we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar, joining the discussion, and hopefully taking action. Our goal at Tech Equity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. So we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live through book club discussions that we host, panel discussions with experts in the field, webinars such as these, and voter guides. We activate you on a policy advocacy agenda that results in a more inclusive economy in your community through voter turnout, signature gathering, and lobbying that we do. And finally, we connect you on a personal level to the community you live in and the people who live there outside of your tech bubble through programming and campaigns that we participate in. So the good news is that members at Tech Equity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. Together, we can advocate for solutions to our region's most pressing shared problems. The pandemic has shown us that the health of our community depends on all of us, and we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So our two issue areas that we focus in on at Tech Equity are housing and workforce and labor. And while housing costs are really a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in many ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agendas to these new realities. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices that we've made over the courses of decades have set us up for this level of pain our community is feeling, especially now during the pandemic. In the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially within communities of color in the Bay Area, and that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings that guided investment. So this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed the riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we can see on the image on the screen. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment or redlined didn't receive any investment. And so these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous rating was in large part based on racial demographics. So, in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and it was a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in the Bay Area. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So as I mentioned, the crisis we're living in is decades in the making. It predates tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. In fact, it extends all across California and all across the United States. So by preventing these entire neighborhoods from being able to access capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived within these red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, What is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic incomes for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. So, an income shock can be anything from a huge rent increase, a sudden loss of a job, or the pandemic, as we saw this year. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So, 46% of Californians are currently in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why all this is happening, but as we talked about, many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions often predate tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. So the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with a lack of affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, it's created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the virus and the pandemic that we're currently in, because many people in our communities were already struggling. So, with unemployment on a steep rise and city and state budgets that are being depleted by emergency response efforts, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. So the cost of living were already high here. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to be able to afford the average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $120,000 a year, you can afford to live in the average two-bedroom, working a normal, regular 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 30 hours a day to be able to afford that two-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're actually setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work. And just to keep this in context, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford San Francisco. There's a common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income within the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but don't receive the minimum benefits and are not paid as much in comparison. So you have to have a good salary to be able to afford that apartment. But why is that apartment so expensive to begin with? So rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. So that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for the lower and moderate income brackets. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of colors have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that you ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while people with higher income are coming in and staying here. So for every high income person coming into the Bay Area, a low income person is being pushed out at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So as you can tell, displacement really is driven by years and years of policy choices. And we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. And the folks that are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by the pandemic. and we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. So, as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of bad policy choices. The good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. So, at Tech Equity, we envision a world where a growing tech driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but it's clear that we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. I'm going to give a brief overview of each of these, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them at the end. So we need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production, preservation, and protection. So production, we need to build more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability, like we just talked about. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of housing by the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation, we need to make sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. And finally, protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build all the necessary housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to make sure that we're protecting tenants from displacement. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are at risk now more than ever, and an economic downturn is also an ideal time to lean heavily into producing more affordable housing as the cost of labor, materials, and land may decrease slightly within the current market conditions. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. So we want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs pay fair wages and benefits regardless of the role. So we were excited to see many tech companies step up and commit to continue paying their contingent workers as the offices closed due to the pandemic. But we need to ensure that the same care and thoughtfulness goes into supporting these workers well beyond the pandemic. So we need to make sure that there are equitable on-ramps. There needs to be more access to good paying, high opportunity jobs. We need corporate responsibility. So companies need to be conscious of their impact within the communities they're in and need to work with community leaders and organizations to ensure that their economic success is benefiting their neighbors as well. And finally, we need to make sure that all jobs are good jobs. We need to make sure that contractors and contingent workers are treated fairly. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved with Tech Equity. We host tons of educational events. So just next week, we have a post-election debrief where we'll be going over the results of the election and what that means for the Bay Area, for the state, with our Director of Advocacy, Megan Abel, and our Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Organizing, Samantha Gordon. So if you have any election questions, please tune in to that event. It will be next week from 12 to 1 p.m. on Thursday. We also have an event coming up in December about titled Should Tech Be Political? So the role of tech companies within the political realm and what their role should be, if any. So that event will be in December. If you're interested in advocacy, you can sign up to volunteer with one of the campaigns. So I'll be talking about shortly. And the final way you can engage with us is through engaging with the community. So we connect tech workers with non-tech community members through some of our volunteer opportunities. So at Tech Equity, we have civic tech projects where if you have any skills, you can donate, whether that's engineering, whether you're a designer, anything, we can pair you with a project with local organizations, and that's a way to connect you with your community. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but also to build community within the process. So what can you do today? Well, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can become a member of Tech Equity Collaborative. So it's $10 a month or $100 a year. Or you can take action on one of our campaigns, which I'll be talking about next. So the first campaign that we have is the Yes on Prop 15 campaign, also known as Schools and Communities First, which just wrapped up. So this campaign was about local governments from public health departments to school districts were leading the fight against the pandemic, but because of California's broken property tax system, they were doing it without all the resources that they needed. So our coalition, Schools and Communities First, qualified a proposition on the ballot this year, which was Prop 15, and it would bring back $12 billion to our schools and communities by closing a corporate tax loophole and making sure that companies pay their fair share in property taxes. So for this campaign, just wrapped up, but just to give you an example, we had volunteers phone bank with us the past couple of months and collect signatures to qualify the proposition earlier in the year before the pandemic. The next campaign we have is the Fair Chance at Housing campaign, also known as Banning the Box in Alameda County. So this campaign is all about helping removing barriers for formerly incarcerated people so that they can have more access to housing after being released from prison. So we successfully had ordinances passed in Oakland and in Berkeley in partnership with the organization Just Cities. So for this campaign, you can sign up to volunteer or donate to support the efforts to expand these protections throughout the entirety of Alameda County. And the final campaign is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which really highlights the work that we do at TechEquity and how we partner with community organizations and center the needs of people who are feeling the pain of the affordability crisis more acutely than most of us in tech. So, working alongside community partners, legislators, and relevant stakeholders, we were able to identify a policy intervention that could protect more renters than any law before in California history. And that policy prevented tenants from arbitrary and unjust evictions by requiring landlords to have a good cause for evicting a tenant. And it also prevented unfair rent increases and prevented price gouging by capping rent increases at no more than 10%. So as a result of our strong coalition, we were able to introduce a bill into the California legislature that was signed into law last October in 2019. So the Tenant Protection Act extends protections to about 8 million renters all throughout California. But passing the law on its own wasn't enough for us. So we also wanted to ensure that tenants and renters knew their rights and could advocate for themselves. So we reached out to our tech equity volunteers who donated their time and skills to create a new website that would help tenants navigate their rights under this new law. So that website's live. It's called tenantprotections.org, and it's already been used by thousands of California renters. So if you know anyone that's a renter, or if you yourself are a renter and you want to see how this law applies to you, once again, that's tenantprotections.org. So as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can take action on one of our campaigns that I just talked about, or future campaigns that we participate in, or you can become a member. The Bay Area's tech economy, as I mentioned, has only been working for some. And while there are great opportunities for people to find success here, many people around us are struggling to just make ends meet. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've seen firsthand how the unaffordability crisis paired with a tech boom has worked for some, but not for all. So I have family who have pursued jobs in tech and found lots of success, but friends and family who have came back from college and cannot afford to move out of their parents' homes, for example. So the Bay Area has a potential to be a ground where tech workers and community members are working side by side to bring equity for everyone. And through policy agendas, civic engagement, and active participation in our communities, we have an opportunity to create the neighborhoods that we always envisioned to live in. So we need to act now because our affordability crisis does not wait for anyone and impacts almost all aspects of our lives, from our housing to our families to our jobs. And in order to make the Bay Area a place that brings opportunity and prosperity for all, it means that everyone needs to pitch in. So at Tech Equity, we're at it every day to bring forth policies that protect renters, that's aiming at building more affordable housing and creating more access to job opportunities. So you can join Tech Equity as a member now for $10 a month or $100 a year to bring your voice to the table and change to our communities. And just to wrap up, the pandemic has exposed how deep the cracks in our economy and communities run. And when cities are setting aside issues like housing and fair labor conditions, it really deepens our inequity and leaves us vulnerable to things like recessions, future pandemics, and more. And because we've overlooked these issues in the Bay Area, it could set us back years in terms of recovery. And if you take one thing away from this conversation, we hope it's the realization that more equity within our communities actually strengthens our economy and safeguards us from a future crisis. So we hope you'll join us in advocating for a future that works for everyone. We hope you join us as a member, as a supporter, as a volunteer, as an event attendee in any way, capacity, or form. So thank you all for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those right now. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email afterwards with all the links to everything I talked about, a bit more information, and you're also able to reply back to that email if you have a question later. So we'll just give it a little bit of time, see if anyone has any questions. Cool. So I'm not seeing any questions. So just once again, thank you so much for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our movement, join us as a member. So if anything pops up, please respond to that email that I'll be sending out shortly this afternoon. And just want to thank everyone for your time and hope to see you in a future event. Thank you, everyone.